Quick thanks to Jordan Day, who requested the continuation of this series. Chapter 3. Navigating through darkness was nothing out of the norm for Mabel. She'd done it many times, besides the fact electric bills were missed at times back at their old homes. Mabel preferred the darkness, immediately ran towards it at Dipper's command. Every little nook and cranny she could fit into, and let the darkness consume her, and shield her from the threats Dipper was always sure to warn her about. She used darkness to her advantage, and took great care in sneaking down the steps as silently as possible. Years of training built into her and allowing her to possess the power to be extremely quiet with her movements. The goal was to reach her destination without alerting anyone, and oftentimes she won. As confident as she was in her ninja skills, she still felt unusually vulnerable without Dipper by her side. She managed to slip down the stairs somewhat effortlessly, but it was a new house, after all, and she hadn't explored it yet. Accidental creaks and snaps made her freeze up in terror, her heart leaping to her throat and making her blood pound in her ears as she listened for anyone lurking in the shadows. Dipper would undoubtedly hate himself if Mabel let herself get hurt, and he wasn't there to protect her. And frankly, the female twin was sick of seeing her brother get that distant look on his face, like he was busy quietly wishing things had been different. Mabel's mind instantly steered to the memory of a feverish and uncomfortable Dipper. A sick Dipper, upstairs in bed. Despite how badly she was beginning to shake, she gallantly reached the bottom of the stairs, pressing back against the wall and blending seamlessly within the shadows as well as possible. There was the unmistakable sound of a laugh track and glowing light emitted from the doorway. Mabel scooted forward, poking her head around the corner like a mouse, emerging from its hidey hole. The man sat in a big, reclining chair, his head tilted backwards as snores rumbled from his direction. He was clad in only a white undershirt and boxers, his ridiculous fez still atop his head. Mabel watched for a minute, and he didn't move or seem to acknowledge she had even reached this floor. Her eyes wandered to the television, and she immediately recognized an episode of Dcat. The female twin still recalled the fond memories of the times her and Dipper got to sit in front of the TV and laugh at the show together, making up theories for the show's future episodes, and having that slice of normal Dipper often fantasized about. It never lasted long. TV privileges never did. But it was something that stuck with the sibling duo, and offered a small sense of security and happiness within the hell they were normally trapped in. She forced herself to look away from the screen, catching sight of what seemed to be the kitchen directly in front of her. The light from the TV barely illuminated a path, and she steadied herself against the wall, suddenly feeling dizzy. She had to move across the doorway, only a few feet from that man, and despite his chances of waking up being slim, Mabel had learned never to assume. Another image of Dipper flashed in her head, interrupting her thoughts, and she pushed herself away from the wall, slowly inching away from the stairs and keeping her gaze locked on the snoring man. She waited a few seconds, counting out in her head, before shooting forward and nearly tripping in her haste to get away from the man's view. She nearly skidded on the tile, bracing herself on the table and desperately searching for what item she needed, and attempted to adjust her eyes to the darkness. A rag, some water, maybe rubbing alcohol if she could find it. That was all she needed. To her surprise, her fingers brushed against plastic and she jerked her hands back, her attention fixed on the wooden dinner table before her. An assortment of bags laid on its surface, and she blinked at the massive haul, and hoped internally that this guy wasn't one of those crazy spenders, though he definitely looked the part. She didn't need the problem of food shortages and stealing from the supermarket again, since Dipper had already concluded it was too much of a hassle and far too risky. She willed herself to tear her gaze away and look for the items Dipper needed, but natural curiosity got the better of her, and she reached up to peer into one of the bags, the plastic hardly rustling under her gentle touch. Within sat two nearly identical teddy bears, one donning a pink bow and the other wearing a blue one. And for who? Certainly not her and Dipper. Mabel knew that trick. She scuttled away from the bears, her heart beginning to pound as her eyes flitted towards the living room once more. It could be a trap for all she knew. She'd been led falsely to believing she had gotten a gift once. The most cutest unicorn plushie she'd ever laid eyes on. Then she had to watch as teenagers tore it apart with a chainsaw, sneering at her and vowing she'd be next if they saw a single tear. She had never seen Dipper as mad as he was that day. And now she hated the idea of charity in the form of plushies, absolutely refusing to become attached, and even now she felt her hands begin to shake and the strange urge to fight herself from breaking into sobs. She needed to get back to the task at hand. She pushed herself away from the table, searching the counters and catching sight of a half-drunk water bottle next to the sink. She snatched it up, opening it and sniffing it to ensure that it was what it said on the label. Then she grabbed the rag off the stove handle and steered herself towards the doorway, her mind bent on getting back to the room and turning that lock. But before she could leave, she crashed directly into something soft. A slight screech escaped her as she collapsed onto the tile. The bottle rolled away from her, and she desperately grabbed at it before freezing and looking up. Stan wasn't sure why he woke so suddenly. His routine typically meant he slept straight through the night until Sue shook him awake later, in time to open the shop and get the day started. But this time, it was like a weird sixth sense forced him out of his slumber. He opened his eyes to the ending credits of Detective, and the odd feeling that he wasn't alone. He pushed himself out of the chair, adjusting his fez on his head and shuffling towards the kitchen, stifling a yawn. Almost immediately, something small and quick smacked into him, nearly knocking him backwards in surprise. He braced himself on the door jamb as a person fell onto the tile with a painful thud. The sound of something rolling across the floor seemed to rile them up. Stan blinked at who he recognized as a girl twin, still wearing her ripped skirt and stained black shirt, riddled with holes. His heart sank as he realized these kids hadn't changed into the clothes he offered, sticking to these rags they regarded as clothing. "Mabel?" Stan questioned, his voice unintentionally loud in the kitchen. Mabel jumped, staring up at him with a look of true fear and terror that he hadn't thought was possible to see in a 12-year-old. It was almost like she'd seen death himself. "I'm sorry!" she squeaked, dropping her things immediately and bringing her arms to her face. Stan felt a surge of anger as he noted the discolored bruises that covered her arms, hardly faded. "Dipper!" "Hey, no, kid, it's alright," Stan began, leaning down to address the girl, but she scooted backwards into a corner, shaking and curling herself into a ball. "Hey!" "No! No attic, ma'am!" Mabel garbled, scooting back a bit farther as she began to sob. "Dipper!" Stan blinked, not thinking he'd need to deal with a breakdown from one of these kids so soon. He searched around for something, anything, and remembered the bag still sitting on the table. He stood himself to full height as Mabel flinched and rummaged through the bag, snatching up one of the bears and bending down to her like she was a wounded animal he was trying hard not to scare off. Look, you like these things, kid?" Stan offered the bear to the small girl, who only shook her head. Tears streaked down her face and her shoulders shook as Stan carefully backed away a bit. "I'm sorry I woke you. I didn't mean to. It's just..." Mabel broke off, only staring down at her sneakers. "Just what?" Stan glanced around at the items on the floor and snorted. "Kid, you were stealing some old water bottle and a rag. They're not exactly my prized possessions. You're not in trouble." Even then, it was like his intended-to-be soothing words had no effect, as the girl curled herself into a tighter ball and continued to call for her brother. Stan sighed and sat back, giving the female twin as much space as possible. "What do you need the things for, kid?" he asked, keeping his voice as low as possible. She didn't look at him, her gaze still fixated on her shoes. Stan sighed, setting the bear down between them. Hey, look at me, will ya? Almost robotically, her head shot up, the young girl's eyes gleaming with tears. Stan frowned, not needing the waterworks, but he couldn't blame this kid. The world is cruel, he thought glumly as he glanced at her battered arms and absolutely terrified expressions. Eye contact was actually painful with this kid. Stan had never seen such fear and helplessness trapped in anyone's gaze, let alone a child. No one's gonna hurt ya, he insisted softly, the girl still staring at him with a sense of uneasiness. No one's gonna hurt ya ever again, ya hear? She blinked slowly, seeming to comprehend his words, but she made no move to accept the bear. Get away from my sister! The voice filled the kitchen, and both Mabel and Stan raised their heads to see Dipper in the doorway, framed by the TV light and looking like he could barely keep himself upright. He looked awful. His hair was plastered to his sweaty forehead, and there were bags under his eyes. He was seeming to precariously keep his weight on one foot and staying off of the other, and shivers wrecked his body, yet Stan couldn't place if that was due to sickness or fear. Dipper moved forward, carrying a gray hoodie, and he approached Mabel easily, the twin throwing her arms around him and stuttering out an apology. Stan watched as this scrawny little kid easily calmed Mabel down, pulling her back and slipping the hoodie on as gently as if she were made of glass. Dipper made a few weird hand motions and Mabel set her hand over her heart, and then the two twins turned their heads towards him. Stan stood up carefully, gauging the kids' reactions and not wanting to see more random tears. Mabel still stared at him with a mix of terrified surprise and morbid curiosity, and Dipper kept a steady gaze on the older man, gripping Mabel's hand and edging himself in front of her. They were back to hanging on to each other, and Stan took that as a sign to stay exactly where he stood. Dipper directed his attention to Mabel. Mabel, I want you to go back to the room. Mabel's eyes widened, and she shook her head. No, Dipper! Don't do this! Now, Mabel! Dipper shot her a pointed look, and the female twin looked torn. She swallowed, glancing at Stan and then at Dipper before staring at the tiles. Dipper, you're sick! Go, Mabel. Mabel remained quiet before slowly getting to her feet and approaching the kitchen's doorway. She looked back for a few seconds before racing down the hall and up the stairs, her shoes stamping on the wood like she had rabid dogs at her ankles. The instant Mabel was gone, Dipper faced Stan, bracing himself against one of the table's chairs. It's not Mabel's fault. I told her to come down here. I doubt that, kid, Stan muttered, leaning against the counter and studying the kid in front of him. The twins' differences were becoming apparent. Mabel was terrified and shrieking, while this kid wasn't afraid to go down swinging. As much as Stan knew he could probably bring Dipper down if the boy threw a punch, he was trying to avoid any sort of confrontation, and he stood back, making no move to approach him. Wendy's earlier encounter didn't make him too eager to get close to the male twin. Even then, Dipper looked like he could barely keep himself standing. Stan studied his emaciated form, bandaged fingers, and unusual shakiness, plus that evident limp. He nodded at the boy's leg. What's wrong with her foot? It's not my foot, Dipper responded smoothly. Well, you look like hell. Are you feeling alright? Stan resisted the urge to palm the kid's forehead, instead choosing to push himself off the counter. Running a fever or anything? Dipper's eyes said it all. The kid looked away, turning his gaze to the clock on the wall. I'm fine. Please don't blame Mabel. She's just trying to help, and I'll tell her never to disturb you again, okay? Just punish me. I told her to do this. I'm not gonna do anything to you. Stan used the opportunity to move forward a step. Look, Dipper. You and your sister have gone through enough hell. I'm not letting that continue. You can trust me. I don't trust anyone, Dipper responded, because when I do, they stab me in the back. I can only trust Mabel. She's my twin. We've been together forever, and it's going to stay like that. You can't depend on each other forever, Stan insisted, taking another step forward. Yes, we can, Dipper snapped back, eyes still locked on the clock. We are a pair. We know everything about each other, and I'm here to protect her, so if you want to punish us, punish me. Yeesh, kid. You're not getting punished. You did nothing wrong. Stan found himself looming above Dipper, the kid starting to pant as he grasped the chair tighter. I know it probably won't be anytime soon, but I'm here for you, kid. You can trust me. Dipper stayed quiet, and he glanced at Stan before bowing his head. Now, to the matter at hand, Stan sighed. You look like shit. Seriously, are you running a fever? Dipper remained silent, and Stan raised his hand, bringing it to Dipper's forehead. The young boy flinched reflexively, and Stan frowned. The kid did have a fever, and a wicked one too. But there was something else about the kid's forehead. Stan lifted Dipper's bang, studying the odd-shaped mark that resembled some type of familiar symbol. It's a burn. Huh? A burn, Dipper repeated, casting his eyes to the floor. My dad burned me when we were caught playing with the stove when Mabel and I were 5. He told me that's what would happen if I fiddled around with something I didn't know about. Dipper didn't look up, but Stan gritted his teeth, fighting to avoid letting away any curse words slip out. The boy continued solemnly. I don't know if it was intentional or whatever, but Dad said it looked a lot like the Big Dipper sign. And he started calling me that, to remind me about the punishment. And the name just kinda stuck. Are you okay with being called that? Stan asked gently, fighting to keep the rising anger from his voice. You got a real name, don't ya? We can call you that. No, sir. I'm fine with it. Dipper finally raised his eyes, looking past Stan's arm, to finally make eye contact. Mabel and I use it because it's the only name he's called me that wasn't degrading, and it's kind of the last thing he gave us. Yeah, sure, kid? Yeah. Dipper wrung his hand, messing with his fingers in an attempt to distract himself. There was something within his voice Stan couldn't quite catch. Guilt, maybe? Shame of sorts? You're ashamed of it? Dipper's gaze shot upwards, a sudden gesture that made Stan hold his hands up apologetically. Hey, it's alright. Yeah, don't gotta answer if you don't want to. He scratched his chin, considering before releasing a weary sigh. I wanna show you something. Yes, sir? The kid cowered, his shoulders rising to his ears, like he was preparing for a blow. You'll keep Mabel out of it, right? Yeesh, kid, I'm not gonna. Stan trailed off, a small sense of understanding sweeping over him. Silently, he turned around, presenting his back to the kid. He lowered a sleeve of his shirt, presenting a bluish brand directly on his shoulder blade. The kid's breath hitched, momentarily surprised, and when Stan covered it back up and turned around, the kid was reaching up, hand hovering over his own burn. I guess you could say I understand, Stan stated, keeping his voice steady. I got in a nasty fight with my brother. This is kinda the painful reminder. So, it is a burn? Dipper's glare was beginning to fade, replaced by silent astonishment. Yeah, don't really look like it, huh? Stan snorted, subconsciously reaching up to rub at the mark. Yeah, burns are a nasty thing, ain't they? Another numb nod. Alright. Stan set his arm down. We're gonna focus on another thing. Giving you something for that fever. I'm fine, Dipper huffed, slapping his hand to his side. I don't want to be a bother. Nah, kid. Stan reached into one of the cupboards, pulling out a small first aid kit and handing it to the boy twin. I've got tons of these lying around the house. Here. Dipper stared at it, seeming to wait to see if the sentiment was a joke or not. After a few seconds, he tentatively took it, edging away from the chair and hugging the pack to his chest. Take care of yourself, kid, Stan muttered, and Dipper blinked at him. He opened his mouth, almost like he wanted to say something, but he ducked his head back and down and took off up the stairs in a flash, his bad foot thumping heavily on the stairs. Yeesh. Stan should have known meeting the kids up close would give him more information than he wanted. He ran a hand down his face, standing numbly in the middle of the kitchen. What did he expect? Taking these kids in? It wasn't going to be like sunshines and rainbows, fun times and instant connections. He was gonna have to work at it, create some mental fantasies of finding their so-called father and kicking his ass. He knew Dipper was protective, but to practically sacrifice himself for the sake of his sister? Well, Stan snorted, removing his fez to run a hand through his hair. I used to do it, too. Those long nights spent sticking himself between him and his brother. The mantra of, it's not his fault! It's not his fault! Ford begging, yelling, their father. Great. Now he needed a beer. Of course that wasn't possible. He disposed of all alcohol, locked the liquor cabinet up tight within his room, and was glad he had. The kids probably had some experience in that factor. He needed to be careful of what he was doing, what habits he portrayed. Gosh, he was gonna have to act feelsy and gentle now, wasn't he? And he still had to inform Ford. That wasn't gonna be fun. Finally, he shook himself out of the trance, taking in a deep breath and raising to his full height. Without a word, he snatched a can of soda and returned to the sofa in the living room. The next morning, Seuss cheerily started the day with a breakfast of pancakes, arriving at the household earlier than usual. Stan took the extra time to throw on his suit, making him somewhat presentable, as a sense of pancakes and bacon wafted through the house. Seuss hummed as he flipped another hot cake onto the plate, swiping up a few strips of bacon and setting it on the side. A perfect breakfast. He grabbed the syrup and then started towards the stairs, as Stan ambled out into the living room. I'm taking some food to the kids, Mr. Pines, Seuss informed as he headed up the steps. Yeah, alright, Stan responded as he adjusted his bow tie. See if you can actually feed the little gremlins. Seuss resumed his humming, approaching the twins' door and glancing at the abandoned plate of mac and cheese and mashed potatoes still sitting on the floor. A rat perched above the food, nibbling away and unperturbed by Seuss's presence. Hiya, Mr. Rat Dude, Seuss greeted before knocking on the door. Hey, little dudes, I brought you some pancakes and bacon. Breakfast of champions! He waited for a minute, straining to hear anything from within the room. There were some furious whispers, and then grating silence. Oh well. Seuss looked around before shrugging. I'll leave them by the door again. Mr. Ratdude's got their dinner from last night, so I think it'll be good here. He trailed off in disappointment, and bent down to set the plate on the floor. To his surprise, the door swung open, and Seuss found himself face to face with Dipper. The boy blinked before glancing at the plate of food and silently holding his hands out. Seuss blinked back, handing the plate over as gently as possible, as well as a bottle of syrup. The boy twin remained quiet, scrutinizing the food before nodding in approval and shutting the door. Seuss got to his feet before scrambling down the steps with his goofy smile on his face. Mr. Pines, they got the food! I'm a twin whisperer! Congratulations, Stan remarked from the kitchen. Now, get to work, will you? The bathroom isn't gonna clean itself. Zeus complied and rushed out of the shop as quickly as possible, urged on by the overwhelming joy of finally succeeding. Stan sipped his coffee and started out towards the shop as well, failing in trying to hide his own smile. Zeus can make some pretty decent pancakes. Dipper shoveled a few more bites into his mouth, the syrup making his hand sticky, as Mabel giggled beside him, having drawn a happy face on her own pancakes. The twins sat on one bed, the sheets rumpled from sleep. Dipper was feeling much better from Mabel's help, and surprisingly ravenous, and the two were in good moods. The morning light was shining throughout the room, and making it feel unusually brighter. "It's Zeus, Dipper," Mabel laughed, setting the syrup aside. "He gave us a whole bottle of syrup. I thought those were just myths." Dipper smiled, popping a piece of bacon into his mouth before sliding the plate in Mabel's direction, leaving the majority of food for his sister. Mabel wrinkled her nose as she recognized Dipper's pattern. Dip, you were sick last night. You can't keep giving me most of the food." "You need it more than I do, Mabel," Dipper insisted, turning away to hopefully avoid conversation. Mabel snorted around a mouthful of pancakes. "I wasn't the one burning alive last night. Can't we split it evenly? Just this once?" Dipper frowned but complied and grabbed another piece of bacon. Much to Mabel's happiness, "All right, just this once." Suddenly there were the telltale sounds of steps coming up the stairs, and the twins froze. Something clattering, and then there was a sound of someone swearing under their breath in annoyance. Seconds later there was a knock at the door. "Hey, kids, I've got some stuff to give ya." Dipper waved at Mabel, his sign to tell her to stay put, and he headed towards the door with caution. He turned the lock, opening the door a crack to see Stan in the doorway, holding an armful of bags. "Kid, these things ain't light," Stan stated, and Dipper frowned. "What's in those?" His voice was tinged with suspicion, and Stan sighed. "Necessities. Nothing bad. I've seen that you and your sister barely have lint in your bags, so I was scrounging up some things. Never say I didn't give you anything." "Oh." Dipper glanced at the floor. "No, return it. We don't want to be trouble." "Oh, please," Stan snorted. "Open the door, kid. My arms are killing me." Dipper studied Stan for a moment before tentatively doing so, stepping aside to allow Stan into the room. Mabel looked up, cowering a bit at the man who entered the room with dozens of bags in his arms. Stan dumped the things on the opposite bed, dusting off his hands and looking towards the twins for a reaction. Dipper stared at the items with suspicion, as Mabel watched with a mix of curiosity and fear. "So," Stan clapped his hands together and began removing things from the bag, setting them carefully on the bed. "I've got you things to get you by for now. I'm no kid expert, but I think I did a pretty damn good job." Mabel slid off the bed and clasped Dipper's hand, and the two walked up to the pile of bags. They watched as Stan set out toothbrushes and hairbrushes and other things they had lost months ago. Mabel gasped once Stan pulled out clothes out. Handbags and skirts and bright-colored sweaters. "Dipper, look! They're not dirty!" Mabel gasped. "They're brand new and everything!" Stan grunted, trying not to show a small twinge he felt in his chest at Mabel's words. "Ugh, feelings." He straightened up, figuring that kids were happy for the bargain bin items and thrift store junk. They'd be thrilled for actual new things. "Well, just to get you by for the week or so, I was thinking..." He paused, watching the two stared with similar doe-eyed looks. Yeesh. They were gonna be the death of him. "Maybe we can head to the mall. You can pick what you want." "Anything?" Mabel murmured, looking genuinely shocked. Is it a dollar store? Only for the clearance section, right? Okay, I'm cheap, but I'm not cruel, Stan shot back. I mean anything in the whole store. Just not, $100 items, of course. You're already sucking my wallet dry. Did you hear that, Dipper? Mabel whispered excitedly. Anything, plus all this. Dipper studied the items before lifting his head to face Dan. How much can we choose? There's no limit involved, Stan assured, feeling his wallet practically incinerating in his pocket. Whatever. He'd tell himself it was for good use. You're getting these clothes, plus whatever you pick. I'm not setting loads of restrictions. But Dipper's words already had an effect. Mabel's smile faded, and she clutched Dipper's arms, staring at the items that littered the bed. Stan frowned, wishing these kids knew how to react to instances like these. Any other kid would have been thrilled to get a shopping spree. They would have been fascinated by the idea of all these new items sitting on the bed. But of course, these twins weren't other kids. They looked conditioned to think every necessity was a bother, and that they only needed the clothes on their back. And Dipper's instant shutdown of Mabel's excitement, trying to save her from what he thought would be disappointment. Stan bit his tongue to avoid cursing out in frustration before nodding to the things on the bed. Go on ahead and look through for now. I gotta go start chores for the day. Dipper nodded, pulling Mabel forward and rifling through the toiletries. Mabel glumly followed, peering longingly at the bright-colored clothes before her eyes flitted up towards Stan and her head ducked down. Stan turned and left the room, silently shutting the door behind him. Almost immediately someone locked it, and the businessman sighed and rubbed the bridge of his nose as he headed towards the shack. Heyo, how's it going, boss? Wendy greeted from the counter. Ready to open doors? Well, we eventually gotta get the show on the road. Stan adjusted his fez before snapping up his cane. How are the kids? Wendy asked, as she leaned against the register. Are they doing better? Well, they're talking to me, and not trembling all the time. That's a good sign, Stan replied as he headed to unlock the door. He flipped the close sign to open before fiddling with his bow tie. Damn thing never ceased to be crooked. It's going as good as it will. Well, sounds better than the one the kid nearly attacked me, Wendy murmured, slumping against the counter as if she were jealous of Stan's current positive interactions. Or relatively, anyways. It wasn't getting tackled. I'm waiting like a week until I try that stunt again. Yeah, real swell. Now get to work. End chapter 3.